The wind howled through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of snow and desperation. Catherine James pressed her back against the rough bark of a pine tree, her breath coming in short, visible puffs that dissipated into the gray morning air. Her fingers, numb despite the worn gloves she wore, clutched the handle of a small carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. The weight of it seemed both insignificant and overwhelming, a paradox that had become the story of her life these past months. She had been walking for 3 days now, following the winding mountain trail that the station master in Millfield had assured her would lead to the logging camps scattered throughout these remote peaks. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion that had grown more insistent with each passing hour. The last of her meager provisions had been consumed yesterday evening, and the stream water she had been drinking did little to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside her. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had carried her this far. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, wife of a respected bank clerk in Philadelphia, living in a modest but comfortable home with lace curtains and a garden where she grew roses. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had read about in a book rather than lived as. The consumption had taken her husband first, then their savings as she desperately sought treatments that never came. When the creditors finally came for the house, she had already sold everything of value, including her wedding ring and the pearl necklace her mother had given her. The journey west had been born of necessity rather than adventure. A widow with no family and no prospects, she had heard whispered stories of opportunities in the frontier territories, places where a person could start over if they were willing to work hard enough. The reality had proven far harsher than the stories suggested. The few positions available to women in the small towns she had passed through required references she could not provide or skills she had never needed to develop. Seamstress work was scarce, and the competition fierce among the women who had arrived before her with the same desperate hopes. Now, standing in this wilderness with winter approaching and her resources exhausted, Catherine faced a truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was going to die out here unless someone took pity on her. And pity was a commodity in short supply in these mountains. The realization should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange calm settling over her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Perhaps this was how it was meant to end. Perhaps she had been foolish to think she could survive in a world that seemed designed to crush women like her. A sound reached her ears through the wind, the rhythmic thunk of an axe biting into wood. Catherine straightened, her heart beginning to race. Where there was wood being cut, there were men working, and where there were men working, there might be someone willing to listen to her plea for employment. She had rehearsed the words so many times they felt like a prayer. Any work at all, sir. Anything you might need done. She would scrub floors, cook meals, mend clothes, tend to the sick, anything that might earn her a place to sleep and a bit of food to keep body and soul together. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Following the sound, Catherine made her way through the trees, her worn boots slipping on the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. The axe blows grew louder, accompanied now by the occasional crack and crash of a falling tree. She paused at the edge of a clearing, taking in the scene before her with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The man wielding the axe was unlike anyone she had encountered in her sheltered city life. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak morning sun. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. His clothes were practical and well-worn. Heavy wool trousers, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and boots that looked as though they had walked 1,000 miles through terrain far rougher than any city street. What struck Catherine most, however, was the economy of his movements. Each swing of the axe was precise and powerful, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes. He worked with the steady rhythm of someone who had been doing this kind of labor for years, his body moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. There was something almost meditative about the way he approached his task, as though the physical exertion provided a kind of peace she had never known. She watched him for several minutes, gathering her courage and trying to find the right moment to interrupt. He seemed completely absorbed in his work, unaware of her presence in the tree line. A pile of split logs grew steadily beside him, and she could see a modest cabin in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, straight line that spoke of warmth and shelter. When he finally paused to wipe his brow with the back of his hand, Catherine stepped forward into the clearing. The movement caught his attention immediately, and he turned toward her with an alertness that made her suddenly conscious of how she must appear. A lone woman in the wilderness, travel-worn and obviously desperate. His hand moved instinctively to the handle of a knife at his belt, not drawing it but ready to do so if necessary. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the clearing. Catherine found herself studying his face, trying to read the expression in his dark eyes. There was wariness there, certainly, but also a kind of measured assessment, as though he were trying to determine what threat, if any, she might pose. His gaze took in her appearance with the same methodical attention he had given to his woodcutting, noting details that might tell him who she was and what she wanted. Quote zero, he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the mountains around them. The single word carried no hostility, but neither did it offer any particular welcome. It was simply an acknowledgement of her presence, an invitation for her to explain herself. Catherine felt her carefully rehearsed words desert her in the face of his steady regard. She had imagined this moment countless times during her journey, but she had always pictured herself speaking to someone more like the men she had known in Philadelphia, men in pressed suits who conducted business from behind polished desks. This man belonged to the wilderness in a way that made her feel like an intruder in his domain. "What's about one?" She began, her voice barely audible above the wind. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing herself to speak louder. Quote ta two. He set the axe aside and turned to face her fully, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement made him seem even larger, if such a thing were possible. But Catherine forced herself to hold her ground. She had come too far to retreat now, regardless of how intimidating he might appear. He repeated, and she could not tell from his tone whether the idea amused him or puzzled him. Tato. The question was reasonable, but it highlighted the fundamental problem she had been grappling with for weeks. What skills did a sheltered city woman possess that would be of value in this harsh environment? She had never cooked over an open fire, never preserved meat or vegetables for winter storage, never tended to injuries more serious than a minor cut or bruise. The domestic arts she had mastered in Philadelphia seemed laughably inadequate when measured against the demands of frontier life. Quote five, she said, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. Quote six, the last was something of an exaggeration based on the months she had spent caring for her dying husband, but it was the closest thing to a practical skill she could claim. He studied her for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Catherine found herself holding her breath, waiting for his response. She could feel the weight of her situation pressing down on her like the gray clouds overhead, heavy with the promise of snow that would make travel impossible and survival unlikely for someone without proper shelter. Quote seven, he asked, and the question caught her off guard. She had expected him to ask about her experience or her references, not about her personal circumstances. Quote eight, she admitted, and the words carried more weight than she had intended. They were an acknowledgement of just how alone she truly was in the world, how completely she had been cut adrift from everything that had once anchored her life. He nodded slowly, as though this information confirmed something he had already suspected. Quote nine, he said, glancing toward the sky where the clouds seemed to be gathering density and purpose. Chapter 10. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Was he warning her away, telling her to leave before the weather trapped her here? She looked around the clearing, taking in the evidence of his solitary existence. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney and windows that had been carefully fitted with real glass rather than oiled paper. The woodpile was substantial, clearly the result of many days of labor like what she had witnessed. Everything spoke of a man who was prepared to face whatever the mountains might throw at him. Quote 11, she said, though she suspected her understanding was woefully inadequate. Quote her 12. Something shifted in his expression at these words, a subtle softening that she might have missed if she had not been watching him so intently. For the first time since she had stepped into the clearing, she sensed that he was seeing her not as a potential threat or inconvenience, but as a fellow human being in need. He said after a pause, quote 14. The words were not unkind, but they carried a weight of experience that made Catherine acutely aware of her own inexperience. Still, she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Quote 15. Benjamin Morris studied her face as though trying to read the truth written there. Catherine had the unsettling feeling that he could see through the brave front she was attempting to maintain, that he understood exactly how desperate her situation had become. The thought should have embarrassed her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. There was something to be said for being seen clearly, even if what was visible was not particularly flattering. Quote 16, he asked suddenly, and the unexpected nature of the question made her blink in surprise. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Each question was like a small blow, highlighting yet another gap in her practical knowledge. He nodded, but not in a way that suggested he was dismissing her. Instead, he seemed to be taking inventory, cataloging what she did not know against what she might be able to learn. Quote 22. The question brought back memories of her husband's final days, when she had cleaned wounds and changed bandages, soaked with the evidence of his body's losing battle against disease. Quote 20. Quote 20. He was quiet for a long time after that, his gaze moving from her face to the mountains around them and back again. Catherine could almost see him weighing possibilities, considering options she could not begin to guess at. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind in the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Finally, Benjamin Morris spoke, his words careful and measured. Catherine felt her heart begin to race. The word partner carried implications she was not sure she was ready to contemplate. But the alternative was continuing her journey into the wilderness, with winter approaching and no prospects for survival. Quote 27, she asked, proud of the steadiness in her voice despite the turmoil in her thoughts. Quote 28, he said simply as though he were discussing the weather or the price of timber. Quote 29. The proposal hit Catherine like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so starkly practical. There was no romance in his words, no declaration of affection or attraction. He was offering a business arrangement, a merger of necessity rather than passion. In her old life, such a proposal would have been scandalous, unthinkable. But her old life was gone, and the woman who had lived it was as dead as her husband. She said, grasping for some rational objection to what he was suggesting. Twice. Benjamin Morris smiled for the first time since she had encountered him, and the expression transformed his entire face. Where before he had seemed stern and forbidding, now she could see traces of warmth and even humor lurking beneath the surface. Quote 32. He agreed. Quote 33. Catherine felt tears prick into the corners of her eyes, though whether they were tears of relief or despair, she could not say. Quote 35. He said with a shrug that suggested such problems were simply part of life's natural challenges. But I got a feeling you're tougher than you give yourself credit for. Woman doesn't walk into these mountains alone unless she's got steel in her spine. The compliment, if that was what it was, warmed Catherine in a way she had not expected. When had anyone last suggested that she possessed strength or courage? Her husband had loved her, certainly, but he had also protected her from the harsher realities of the world, treating her like a delicate flower that needed constant tending. The creditors and townspeople who had witnessed her fall from respectability had looked at her with pity or disdain, never with anything approaching respect. I would need time to consider your proposal, Mr. Morris, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were more for form's sake than from any real uncertainty. What choice did she have? She could continue down the mountain and hope to find someone else willing to employ her, but winter was coming and her resources were exhausted. She could try to make her way to one of the larger towns, but that would require money she did not possess and strength she was not sure she could summon. Quote 38, he said, nodding as though this were perfectly reasonable. Quote 39, the offer was more generous than Catherine had any right to expect, and it solved her immediate problem of finding shelter for the night. Still, she hesitated, aware that accepting his hospitality would create an obligation she might not be able to repay. He said, cutting off her protest with a wave of his hand, quote 42. The mention of food made Catherine's stomach clench with renewed hunger, and she realized that her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Thank you, she said simply. I would be grateful for your hospitality. Benjamin Morris gathered up his tools with the same methodical efficiency she had observed in his woodcutting, then gestured for her to follow him toward the cabin. As they walked across the clearing, Catherine found herself studying her surroundings with new eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like to call this place home. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked against the weather. A covered porch ran along the front, providing shelter from rain and snow, and she could see evidence of thoughtful planning in every detail. This was not the rough shelter of a man simply trying to survive, but the carefully constructed home of someone who intended to stay. The interior was surprisingly comfortable with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and furniture that, while simple, was well made and functional. The air was warm and filled with the rich aroma of cooking food, making Catherine suddenly lightheaded with hunger and anticipation. "Sit yourself down," Benjamin said, indicating a chair near the fire. "I'll get you something to eat." Catherine sank into the offered chair with a gratitude that went beyond words. The warmth from the fire seemed to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill that had been her constant companion for days. She watched as Benjamin moved around the small kitchen area with practiced ease, ladling stew into a wooden bowl and cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread that looked as though it had been baked that morning. When he placed the food in front of her, Catherine had to exercise considerable self-control to keep from falling on it like a wild animal. The stew was rich and hearty, filled with chunks of meat and vegetables that spoke of careful preparation and abundant resources. The bread was dense and flavorful, clearly made from quality flour rather than the coarse meal she had grown accustomed to during her travels. "This is excellent," she said between bites, and meant it. "Did you prepare it yourself?" "Man living alone learns to cook, or he starves," Benjamin replied with a slight smile. "Took me a while to get the hang of it, but I manage well enough now." The admission gave Catherine her first real glimpse of what her life might be like if she accepted his proposal. She would not be expected to take over all domestic duties simply by virtue of being a woman. Instead, they would be partners in the truest sense, sharing the work and the responsibilities according to their abilities and the demands of the situation. As she ate, Benjamin busied himself with small tasks around the cabin, giving her space to process what had happened while maintaining a comfortable presence. Catherine found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the stern figure she had first encountered with this more domestic version. He moved through the space with the same economy of motion she had observed in his woodcutting, wasting no energy on unnecessary movements while accomplishing what needed to be done. "Mr. Morris," she said when she had finished eating and could no longer contain her curiosity, "may I ask what brought you to these mountains? You do not seem like a man who was born to this kind of life." He paused in his task of banking the fire for the night and looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "What makes you say that?" "Your speech, for one thing. You are educated, though you try to hide it. And your cabin, the way you have arranged things. There is a refinement here that speaks of someone who has known a different kind of life." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine wondered if she had overstepped some boundary by asking such a personal question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her regret her curiosity. "Used to be a teacher," he said simply. "Back in Ohio. Had a wife, a little house near the school where I taught. Thought I had everything a man could want." The past tense told Catherine everything she needed to know about how that life had ended, and she felt a pang of recognition. They were both refugees from lives that had been taken from them, both trying to build something new from the wreckage of what they had lost. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not mean to pry into painful memories." "No harm in asking," he replied, though she could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. "Been 5 years now, time enough to make peace with it, mostly." The word "mostly" hung in the air between them. Acknowledgement that some wounds never fully healed, no matter how much time passed. Catherine understood that feeling all too well. The grief for her husband had dulled to a manageable ache, but she suspected it would always be there, a part of her as permanent as the color of her eyes. "What about you?" Benjamin asked, settling into the chair across from her. "What brought a Philadelphia lady to these mountains?" Catherine found herself telling him her story, the words coming easier than she had expected. She spoke of her marriage, her husband's illness, the slow erosion of everything they had built together. She told him about the creditors and the loss of her home, about the journey west that had begun with hope and gradually transformed into desperate flight. Through it all, Benjamin listened without judgment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and outside the wind had died down to a gentle whisper through the trees. For the first time in months, Catherine felt something approaching peace. Quote 63, she said finally. Quote 64. Benjamin raised an eyebrow, inviting her to continue. Quote 60, Benjamin said quietly. Quote son, his response surprised her. She had expected him to point out the impracticality of maintaining moral standards when faced with starvation and exposure. Instead, he seemed to respect her for drawing such lines. He continued. The clarification removed Catherine's last serious objection to his proposal. She had been raised to believe that marriage carried certain obligations, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. The idea that she could enter into such an arrangement while maintaining control over her own person was both liberating and terrifying. You would be content with such an arrangement, she asked? A marriage that might never become more than a business partnership? Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though seeking answers in the dancing flames. Been alone up here for 5 years, he said finally. Company would be welcome, even if that's all it ever amounts to. And truth is, Miss James, I ain't sure I got anything more than that to offer. The man who knew how to love a woman proper died with his wife back in Ohio. What's left might not be worth much to someone looking for romance and tender feelings. Catherine felt her heart constrict at the pain in his voice. Here was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, just as she had. The difference was that he seemed to have convinced himself that his capacity for love had died with his wife, while she still harbored secret hopes that she might someday feel that kind of connection again. Perhaps, she said carefully, two people who have lost the ability to love might find comfort in each other's company, even if they can never find passion. Perhaps they might, Benjamin agreed, and something in his tone suggested that he was not as convinced of his own emotional limitations as he wanted to appear. They talked for another hour, discussing practical matters like the division of labor and the supplies they would need to see them through the winter. Catherine found herself impressed by Benjamin's planning and foresight. He had been preparing for the cold months since spring, laying in stores of food and fuel, making repairs to the cabin and outbuildings, thinking through every detail that might mean the difference between comfort and suffering when the snows came. As the evening wore on, Catherine became aware of a growing sense of rightness about the situation. The practical arguments for accepting Benjamin's proposal were overwhelming, but there was something more than mere necessity drawing her toward this decision. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt as though she might have found a place where she belonged, a role she could fill that would give her life meaning and purpose. When Benjamin finally showed her to the small bedroom where she would spend the night, Catherine knew what her answer would be. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the mountain night. But her mind was made up. In the morning, she would accept his proposal and begin the process of transforming herself from a helpless refugee into a mountain woman capable of surviving whatever challenges lay ahead. The decision should have terrified her. Instead, as she finally drifted off to sleep, Catherine felt something she had not experienced in months: hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new uncertainties, but it would also bring the chance to build something lasting with a man who understood loss and survival in ways that resonated with her own experience. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the first few flakes of snow that would soon blanket the mountains in white. Winter was coming, but Catherine James was no longer facing it alone. Whatever lay ahead, she would meet it as part of a partnership forged not in romance, but in mutual need and respect. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was a life nonetheless, and that was more than she had dared to hope for when she had first stepped into Benjamin Morris's clearing that morning. The snow continued to fall as she slept, covering the world outside in a pristine blanket that would soon make travel impossible and trap them together in the small cabin until spring. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in months, Catherine James slept peacefully. dreaming not of the life she had lost, but of the one she might yet build. When she woke the next morning, the world outside had been transformed. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, accumulating to a depth that would have made her journey down the mountain treacherous, if not impossible. As she stood at the window, taking in the pristine landscape, Catherine realized that the decision had been made for her in a way that went beyond her own choosing. Benjamin was already up and moving around the cabin, preparing breakfast and tending to the fire. He looked up when he heard her stirring, and she could see the question in his eyes even though he was too polite to voice it. "Mr. Morris," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I would be honored to accept your proposal." He nodded slowly as though he had expected this answer, but was still processing what it meant. "Then I reckon we best get started figuring out how to make this work." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Catherine James began the first day of her new life as a mountain woman, unaware that the greatest challenges and dangers still lay ahead, waiting in the white silence of the approaching winter. The first weeks of their arrangement passed in a careful dance of necessity and politeness. Catherine threw herself into learning the skills that would make her useful, watching Benjamin's every movement as he demonstrated how to preserve meat, how to bank a fire to last through the night, how to read the sky for signs of approaching weather. Her hands, soft from years of genteel living, quickly developed calluses from splitting kindling and hauling water from the spring. The work was harder than anything she had ever imagined, but there was a satisfaction in it that surprised her. Benjamin proved to be a patient teacher, though he spoke little beyond what was necessary to convey information. He would show her a task once, watch her attempt it, then quietly correct her mistakes without making her feel foolish for not knowing what seemed to come naturally to him. When she struggled to lift a heavy pot of water, he would simply take it from her hands and carry it himself. No judgment in his actions. When she burned the first batch of bread she attempted to make, he ate it without complaint and suggested adjustments for the next attempt. The sleeping arrangements had been settled with minimal awkwardness. Benjamin had moved his belongings to a small storage room behind the kitchen, leaving Catherine the bedroom with its single window and sturdy bed. A heavy curtain provided privacy, and they had established routines that allowed them to share the small space without undue intimacy. She rose early to tend the fire and prepare breakfast while he saw to the animals and checked his traps. Evenings were spent in companionable silence, she mending clothes by lamplight, while he worked on various repairs and preparations for the deeper winter ahead. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Catherine first heard the sound that would change everything. A distant crack echoed through the mountains, sharp and unnatural against the whisper of wind through the pines. Benjamin's head came up immediately, his body going still with the alertness of a wild animal sensing danger. "What was that?" Catherine asked, setting down her sewing. Benjamin was already moving toward the window, his movements careful and controlled. "Gunshot," he said quietly, peering out into the darkness. "Too far off to be meant for us, but close enough to matter." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cabin walls. In her sheltered city life, the sound of gunfire had been limited to 4th of July celebrations and the occasional hunting party passing through the outskirts of town. Here, in this isolated wilderness, a gunshot carried different implications entirely. "Could it be hunters?" she asked, though something in Benjamin's posture suggested he did not think so. "Quote," he replied, still watching the darkness beyond the window. Quote. The distinction was lost on Catherine, but she could see the tension in Benjamin's shoulders, the way his hand had moved instinctively to rest on the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Whatever that distant gunshot meant, it had transformed her quiet evening into something charged with potential danger. Over the next several days, they heard more shots, always distant but seeming to come from different directions. Benjamin began taking his rifle with him when he went to check his traps, and he started varying his routes, never taking the same path twice in a row. He said little about these precautions, but Catherine noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line when they were outside, the way he positioned himself between her and the forest when they worked in the clearing. It was Ashley Diaz who brought them the first real news of what was happening in the mountains. Catherine had been hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard Benjamin's voice calling out a greeting. She came around the corner to find a young woman dismounting from a tired-looking horse, her clothes travel-stained and her face drawn with exhaustion. Ashley was perhaps 20 years old, With dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that held the kind of wariness Catherine was learning to recognize in people who lived on the frontier. She worked as a messenger and sometimes guide for the various mining camps and logging operations scattered throughout the region, carrying mail and news between settlements that might not see another soul for weeks at a time. Quote Audit 86, Ashley said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered with obvious gratitude. Cot showered them. Catherine served them both generous portions of the venison stew that had been simmering all morning, noting how Ashley's eyes lit up at the sight of a proper meal. The young woman ate with the focused intensity of someone who had been living on trail rations for too long. There's been trouble, Ashley began between bites. Started about 2 weeks ago down near Cedar Falls. Gang of men rode into town, claimed they were looking for work at the mill, but they weren't interested in honest labor. Been robbing travelers on the mountain roads, hitting isolated homesteads, taking whatever they can carry, and burning what they can't. Benjamin's face had gone grim during this recitation. Quote 90. Quote 90. Catherine felt her stomach clench with fear. The isolation that had seemed like a blessing when she first arrived at Benjamin's cabin now felt like a trap. If these men decided to target them, there would be no help coming, no law enforcement to intervene. They've been working their way up into the high country? Benjamin asked. Ashley nodded grimly. Hit the Peterson place 3 days ago. Old man Peterson tried to fight them off, and they killed him for his trouble. Took his wife and daughter with them when they left. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had met Mrs. Peterson and her daughter Julie during one of their trips to the trading post. They were quiet, hardworking women who had shown her nothing but kindness when she was still obviously a newcomer, struggling to adapt to mountain life. Deborah Ortiz saw smoke from her place and rode over to investigate. Ashley continued. Found Peterson's body and the house burned to the ground. No sign of the women, but tracks leading further up into the mountains. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared into the fire. Catherine could see him processing this information, weighing options and possibilities she could not begin to guess at. They know about this place? He asked finally. Don't reckon so, Ashley replied. You're pretty well hidden up here, and most folks don't know exactly where you're settled. But if they keep working their way up the mountain, they might stumble across your clearing eventually. Catherine found her voice, though it came out smaller than she had intended. What can we do? Ashley looked at her with something that might have been pity. Not much, honestly. We could leave, Catherine said, looking between Ashley and Benjamin. Pack up what we need and head down to one of the larger settlements until this passes. Benjamin shook his head slowly. Winter's too deep now. Roads are impassable, and we'd freeze to death trying to make it through the passes. Besides, running might just put us right in their path. The conversation continued for another hour, with Ashley sharing what details she knew about the gang's movements and methods. They seemed to be following a pattern, hitting isolated targets and then moving to new areas before any organized resistance could form. They were smart enough to avoid the larger settlements where armed men might band together against them, focusing instead on lone homesteaders in small family groups who could not mount effective resistance. When Ashley finally prepared to leave, she pressed a folded paper into Benjamin's hands. List of places they've hit and when, she explained, might help you figure out where they're headed next. After Ashley rode away, Catherine and Benjamin spent the evening studying the paper and discussing their options. The pattern of attacks did seem to be moving steadily up into the higher elevations, which meant their cabin might indeed be in the gang's eventual path. Quote 106, Catherine suggested. Quote 107. Quote 100, and Benjamin agreed, though he did not sound convinced. Quote 109. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Catherine had heard stories of what happened to women who fell into the hands of such men, stories that had once seemed like distant horrors from a world she would never encounter. Now that world had found her, creeping up the mountain like a deadly avalanche. Over the next several days, Benjamin began making preparations that chilled Catherine's blood. He cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin, including an old pistol he pressed into her hands with instructions on how to use it. He showed her hiding places he had prepared years earlier, spaces behind false walls and under floorboards where supplies could be concealed. Most ominously, he began teaching her alternate routes through the forest, paths that would allow her to escape the cabin and make her way to other settlements if the worst happened. "I don't want to leave you," Catherine protested during one of these lessons. "If trouble comes, we should face it together." Benjamin stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Catherine, listen to me carefully. These men will kill me without a second thought, but they'll keep you alive for reasons you don't want to think about. If it comes to a fight, your job is to get away and stay away. Don't try to help me. Don't try to be a hero. Just run." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions began to give way to something deeper, born of shared danger and mutual dependence. Catherine found herself watching Benjamin with new eyes, noting the way he moved through the world with constant vigilance, the way his hands were never far from a weapon, the way he positioned himself to always have a clearer view of potential escape routes. For his part, Benjamin seemed to be seeing her differently as well. Where once he had treated her like a fragile city woman who needed protection from the harsh realities of mountain life, now he began including her in discussions of tactics and preparation. He taught her to read tracks in the snow, to recognize the signs that someone had been watching their cabin from the tree line. He showed her how to move quietly through the forest, how to use natural cover to avoid detection. The lessons were born of necessity, but they brought them closer together in ways that their domestic partnership had not. There was an intimacy and shared danger that went beyond the physical proximity they had maintained out of politeness. When Benjamin showed her how to hold the pistol, his hands covering hers as he guided her aim, Catherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the weapon's potential for violence. When she successfully identified the tracks of a deer versus those of a man, the approval in his eyes meant more to her than any compliment she had ever received. It was during one of these training sessions that they heard the sound that confirmed their worst fears. Voices carried on the wind, rough and unfamiliar, coming from the direction of the main trail that led up from the valley. Benjamin immediately motioned for silence, pulling Catherine behind a large boulder where they could observe without being seen. Through the trees, they could make out the shapes of mounted men, perhaps 6 or 7 of them, moving slowly up the trail as though searching for something. Even at a distance, there was something predatory about the way they moved, a casual confidence that spoke of men accustomed to taking whatever they wanted. Catherine pressed herself against the cold stone, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the riders would hear it. Benjamin's body was tense beside her, every muscle coiled for action. His rifle lay across his knees, ready to be raised and fired at a moment's notice. The riders paused at a point where several game trails intersected, and Catherine could hear the murmur of their voices as they discussed which direction to take. One of them dismounted and began examining the ground, looking for tracks or other signs of human habitation. Catherine realized with growing horror that the man was following the faint path that led to their clearing, the route she and Benjamin used when traveling to and from the trading post. After what felt like an eternity, the tracker remounted his horse, and the group continued up the main trail, apparently deciding that the side path was not worth investigating. Catherine and Benjamin remained hidden until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, then made their way back to the cabin in tense silence. Quote 113, Benjamin said once they were safely inside. Quote 114. Catherine sank into her chair by the fire, her legs suddenly weak with the aftershock of fear. Quote 115. Quote 160. That night they took turns keeping watch, one sleeping while the other sat by the window with a rifle across their lap. Catherine had never imagined that she would be capable of such vigilance, but desperation had a way of revealing capabilities she had never known she possessed. When her turn came to stand guard, she found herself listening to every sound the night made, trying to distinguish between the natural creaks and sighs of the forest and the potential footsteps of approaching danger. It was during her watch that she first saw the glow on the horizon, a faint orange light that flickered against the low-hanging clouds. At first she thought it might be the aurora, but the color was wrong, too warm and too localized. With growing dread, she realized she was looking at the light of a distant fire, large enough to be visible from miles away. She woke Benjamin immediately, and together they watched the glow strengthen and then gradually fade as whatever was burning was consumed by the flames. Neither of them spoke, but they both understood what they were seeing. Another homestead had fallen to Jacob Stewart and his men, Another family had paid the ultimate price for living in the path of these predators. The next morning brought Ashley Diaz again, her horse lathered with sweat and her face were grim with news that confirmed their worst fears. The fire they had seen had been the Matthews homestead, a prosperous ranch about 10 miles down the valley. Raymond Phillips and his family had tried to make a stand, but they had been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The 100 Ashley reported, her voice flat with the kind of emotional exhaustion that came from delivering too much bad news. Quote 118. Catherine felt sick to her stomach. She had met the Phillips family several times, had admired the way Raymond and his wife Eugene worked together to build something lasting in this harsh environment. Their sons had been barely old enough to be considered men, probably no more than 16 and 18 years old. Quote 119, she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Ashley's expression grew even grimmer. Gone, along with their daughter Kimberly. Same as the Peterson women. No bodies found, but plenty of tracks leading further up into the mountains. Benjamin had been studying the map Ashley had brought, marking the locations of the attacks with small X's. The pattern was becoming clearer and more ominous with each new incident. The gang was indeed working its way up into the high country, following a roughly circular route that would eventually bring them very close to Benjamin's hidden clearing. How much time do you think we have? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Based on their patterns so far, maybe a week. Ashley replied, they seem to be hitting a new place every few days, taking time to scout their targets and plan their attacks. But they're also getting bolder, taking bigger risks. That suggests they might be planning something major, maybe a final big score before they move on to other territories. After Ashley left, Catherine and Benjamin spent the day making final preparations. They buried their most valuable possessions in the root cellar, covered the cache with dirt, and arranged the remaining vegetables to hide any signs of disturbance. Benjamin showed Catherine one last escape route, a difficult path that led over a high ridge and down into a valley where a trapper named Eugene Kim maintained a small cabin. If something happens to me, you follow that trail, Benjamin instructed. Don't stop, don't look back, don't try to help. Eugene's a good man, and he'll see you safe to one of the larger settlements when the weather breaks. Catherine wanted to argue, to insist that they would face whatever came together, but the steel in Benjamin's voice told her that this was not a discussion. He was preparing for the worst-case scenario, and her survival was more important to him than his own. The realization brought tears to her eyes, though she tried to hide them. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing what might be their last peaceful meal together, Catherine found herself studying Benjamin's face in the flickering light. Over the weeks they had been together, she had grown accustomed to his presence, had come to depend on his steady competence and quiet strength. The thought of losing him, of being alone again in a world that seemed designed to destroy women like her, was almost unbearable. Benjamin, she said softly, and something in her tone made him look up from the rifle he was cleaning. I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest I've known since my husband died. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the chance to build something with you. He set down the rifle and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Catherine, I need to tell you something. When I first offered you this arrangement, I thought I was doing it out of practical necessity. Two people surviving better than one. That kind of thinking. She waited, sensing that there was more he needed to say. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. Watching you learn, watching you adapt to this life, seeing the strength you didn't know you had. You've become important to me in ways I didn't expect. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to explore fully. Catherine felt her heart racing, not with fear this time, but with something warmer and more complex. I feel the same way, she said quietly. I thought I would never care about anyone again, the way I cared about my husband. But what I feel for you is different, deeper maybe, because it's built on really knowing each other. Benjamin reached across the small table and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. If we get through this, if we survive whatever is coming, I'd like to explore what that means. Build something real together, not just an arrangement born of necessity. I'd like that too, Catherine replied, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. They might have said more, might have finally bridged the careful distance they had maintained since that first night, but the sound of a horse approaching at speed cut through the quiet evening air. Benjamin was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, while Catherine moved to the window to peer out into the darkness. The rider who emerged from the tree line was Matthew Hill, a neighbor from several miles down the valley. His horse was foam-flecked and trembling with exhaustion, and Matthew himself looked as though he had aged 10 years since Catherine had last seen him. "Benjamin," he called out as he dismounted. "Thank God you're still here. They're coming, maybe 6 hours behind me. I saw their camp from a ridge about 15 miles south. They'll be here by dawn." Catherine felt the bottom drop out of her world. 6 hours. After all their preparation, all their planning, they had perhaps 6 hours before Jacob Stewart and his gang arrived at their door. Benjamin was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. "How many men?" he asked Matthew. "I counted 9, maybe 10. Well armed, well mounted. They've got the Peterson and Phillips women with them, tied to horses like baggage." Matthew's voice cracked with emotion. Quote 138. Catherine closed her eyes, trying not to imagine what Julie Peterson and Eugene Phillips had endured during their captivity. The thought of suffering the same fate made her stomach clench with terror, but it also hardened her resolve. She would not go quietly into that darkness. Quote, Benjamin said, his voice cutting through her dark thoughts. Quote 40, quote Warrior, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Quote 140, quote 190, quote she interrupted. Quote Wartian. Benjamin looked as though he wanted to argue, but Matthew Hill spoke up from where he was tending to his exhausted horse. Quote 146. Catherine could see the internal struggle playing out on Benjamin's face. Every instinct told him to protect her by sending her away, but his tactical mind could see the logic in Matthew's words. 2 rifles were better than 1, especially when defending a prepared position against attackers who did not know the ground. Quote 47. Benjamin asked. Quote Warsam. The older man shook his head regretfully. Quote Wartampan. After Matthew left, continuing his desperate ride through the night to warn others, Catherine and Benjamin spent the remaining hours before dawn making final preparations. They moved through the cabin like ghosts, checking weapons, positioning ammunition, reviewing their defensive plan one last time. Benjamin had chosen their fighting positions carefully. The cabin sat in a natural clearing that provided good fields of fire in all directions, but it was also backed up against a steep, rocky slope that would prevent the attackers from surrounding them completely. He had prepared several shooting positions, both inside the cabin and in the surrounding trees, allowing them to move between locations and avoid being pinned down in one spot. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Catherine found herself thinking not of death but of life, of the future she and Benjamin might build together if they survived the next few hours. The irony was not lost on her that she had finally found something worth living for, just as she was about to risk everything to defend it. Quote 150. Benjamin said softly, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression of profound tenderness. Quote 101. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they gave voice to feelings she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. 152, she whispered, and the admission felt like a prayer and a promise combined. They might have said more, might have finally allowed themselves the luxury of exploring these newfound feelings, but the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air like a blade. Jacob Stewart and his gang had arrived, and the time for words was over. Through the window, Catherine could see them emerging from the tree line, 9 men on horseback moving with the casual confidence of predators who had never met serious resistance. They spread out as they approached the cabin, surrounding it in a loose circle that would make escape impossible. The man who appeared to be their leader, presumably Jacob Stewart himself, was younger than Catherine had expected, probably no more than 30 years old. But there was something in his eyes, even at a distance, that spoke of casual cruelty and complete indifference to human suffering. He sat his horse like a man accustomed to command, surveying the cabin and its surroundings with the calculating gaze of someone planning an attack. Quote 153, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. Quote 154. Benjamin positioned himself at the window, rifle ready but not yet visible to the attackers. Quote 155 on quote 1.601. The casual way he spoke of Catherine as though she were simply another piece of property to be appropriated sent a surge of rage through her that surprised her with its intensity. She had never felt such pure, focused anger in her entire life. Benjamin replied, his voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced. Stuart laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. Good panam. Catherine watched as the other gang members began dismounting, spreading out to approach the cabin from multiple angles. Some of them carried rifles, others had pistols drawn. All of them moved with the practiced coordination of men who had done this many times before. Quote 159, Stuart called out, quote Waxtum. Benjamin's response was to raise his rifle and put a bullet through the crown of Stuart's hat, close enough to part his hair, but not quite close enough to kill. The message was clear: they would not surrender, and the gang leader was not as safe as he thought. The reaction was immediate and violent. Stuart's men opened fire on the cabin, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass as they tried to suppress any return fire. Catherine pressed herself against the floor, covering her head as debris rained down around her. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire that seemed to go on forever. When the initial barrage finally stopped, Benjamin was already moving, crawling to a different window to return fire. His first shot took down one of the attackers, a clean hit that sent the man spinning to the ground. His second shot wounded another, causing him to retreat behind a tree while clutching his shoulder. Catherine forced herself to move to her own assigned position, a narrow window that gave her a view of the cabin's north side. Her hands were shaking as she raised the rifle Benjamin had given her, but her mind was surprisingly clear. She could see two men trying to work their way closer to the cabin, using the sparse cover of the trees to mask their approach. She had never shot at another human being before, had never even imagined herself capable of such a thing. But as she watched these men advancing with clear intent to kill her and Benjamin, she found that her moral qualms evaporated like morning mist. These were not human beings in any meaningful sense. They were predators, and she was defending her life and the life of the man she loved. Her first shot missed, kicking up dirt several feet to the left of her intended target. But the sound was enough to make both men dive for better cover, disrupting their advance. Her second shot was better, close enough to send splinters flying from the tree one of them was hiding behind. The battle settled into a deadly pattern of advance and retreat, with Stuart's men trying to work closer while Benjamin and Catherine did their best to keep them at bay. The gang had numbers and experience on their side, but the defenders had better positions and superior knowledge of the terrain. As the morning wore on, Catherine found herself adapting to the rhythm of combat with a facility that would have horrified her former self. She learned to conserve ammunition, to wait for clear shots rather than wasting bullets on targets that were well covered. She learned to move between positions during lulls in the firing, presenting the attackers with multiple threats they had to account for. Benjamin fought with the methodical precision she had observed in all his other activities, each shot carefully aimed and most of them finding their mark. By midday, he had accounted for at least 3 of the attackers, while Catherine had managed to wound 2 others badly enough to put them out of the fight. But their ammunition was running low, and Stuart's remaining men were learning from their mistakes. They had stopped trying to rush the cabin and were instead working to establish positions that would allow them to maintain a siege. Catherine realized with growing dread that time was not on their side. Eventually, their bullets would run out, and then they would be helpless against the remaining attackers. It was during a brief lull in the firing that she heard the sound that changed everything, the distant crack of rifle fire coming from the direction of the main trail. At first, she thought it might be more of Stuart's men arriving as reinforcements, but the pattern was wrong. Instead of the coordinated volleys they had been facing, this was sporadic shooting, the kind that suggested a running battle. Benjamin had heard it too, and he was listening intently, trying to make sense of what was happening beyond their immediate field of battle. "That's not coming from Stuart's people," he said finally. "Someone else is out there." The realization hit Catherine like a thunderbolt. Matthew Hill had been riding through the night to warn other settlers, and some of them had apparently decided to come to their aid. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she could hear shouts and the thunder of approaching horses. Stuart had heard it too, and she could see him trying to rally his remaining men for what he clearly realized would be a final assault on the cabin. If he was going to take what he had come for, It would have to be now, before whatever reinforcements were approaching could arrive to tip the balance. "They're going to rush us," Benjamin warned, checking his ammunition and finding only a handful of cartridges remaining. "When they come, shoot fast and shoot straight. Don't worry about conserving bullets." Catherine nodded, her own supply of ammunition nearly exhausted. She could see Stewart's men gathering themselves for the attack, their faces grim with the knowledge that this was likely their last chance to succeed before they would be caught between the cabin's defenders and whoever was approaching from behind. The final assault came with desperate fury. Stewart's remaining men charged the cabin from 3 different directions simultaneously, firing as they ran and screaming like wild animals. Catherine found herself shooting as fast as she could work the rifle's action, not bothering to aim carefully but simply trying to put as much lead in the air as possible. One of the attackers made it almost to the cabin's front door before Benjamin's rifle spoke for the last time, sending the man sprawling in the dirt just feet from their threshold. Another got close enough to the north window that Catherine could see his face clearly, twisted with rage and bloodlust, before her final bullet took him in the chest and sent him tumbling backward. Then her ammunition was gone, and Benjamin's rifle clicked empty, and Catherine was certain they were about to die. But instead of the final rush she expected, the remaining attackers suddenly found themselves under fire from behind as a group of mounted men burst into the clearing. Eugene Kim led the charge, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as he and 5 other settlers poured fire into Stewart's surprise gang. Caught it between 2 forces and outnumbered for the first time in their criminal careers, the surviving outlaws broke and ran. Those who could still move fleeing into the forest on foot after their leader fell with Eugene's bullet in his heart. The sudden silence that followed the gunfire was almost as deafening as the battle itself had been. Catherine found herself shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight now leaving her system in a rush that left her weak and disoriented. Benjamin was beside her immediately, his arms around her as she struggled to process what had just happened. They were alive. Against all odds, against superior numbers and firepower, they had survived. More than that, they had won. Eugene Kim and the other settlers were already moving through the clearing, checking the bodies of the fallen outlaws and making sure there were no wounded enemies who might still pose a threat. The rescued women, Julie Peterson and Eugene Phillips, were found tied to horses at the edge of the clearing, traumatized but alive. As Catherine looked around at the aftermath of the battle, at the men who had risked their lives to save her and Benjamin, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. These people, these hard mountain folk who lived by codes she was still learning to understand, had come when called. They had put their own lives at risk to defend neighbors they might see only a few times a year. She was no longer an outsider looking in, no longer a city woman playing at frontier life. She had fought alongside Benjamin to defend their home, had proven herself capable of the kind of courage and determination that this harsh land demanded. She belonged here now, not because someone had taken pity on her, but because she had earned her place through trial by fire. Benjamin's arms tightened around her as the full magnitude of their survival began to sink in. They had faced the worst this unforgiving wilderness could throw at them, and had emerged not just alive, but stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as true partners in every sense of the word. The winter wind that had brought her to this place months ago now seemed like a gentle breeze compared to the storm they had just weathered. And as Catherine looked up into Benjamin's eyes, she saw not just relief and gratitude, but something deeper and more lasting. The recognition that they had found in each other exactly what they needed to not just survive, but to truly live. But even as they celebrated their victory and tended to their wounds, neither Catherine nor Benjamin noticed the lone figure watching from the distant ridge, a survivor of Stewart's gang who had escaped the final battle and was already planning his revenge. The immediate danger had passed, but the mountains still held secrets and threats that would test their newfound bond in ways they could not yet imagine. The story of Catherine James and Benjamin Morris was far from over, and the greatest challenges to their love and survival still lay ahead, hidden in the snowy peaks and dark valleys of the unforgiving wilderness they now called home. The lone survivor crouched behind the twisted remains of a lightning-struck pine, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air as he watched the celebration below. Marcus Thorne had been riding with Jacob Stewart's gang for nearly 2 years, long enough to develop a reputation for cunning that had kept him alive when bolder men had fallen. While his companions had charged headlong into what became their final battle, Marcus had positioned himself on the ridge above, ready to provide covering fire or escape routes as circumstances demanded. Now, as he observed the settlers tending to their wounded and securing the clearing, Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation mixed with cold calculation. He had watched Stewart fall, had seen the rest of the gang cut down or scattered like leaves before a winter storm. The easy pickings they had enjoyed throughout these mountains were finished, but that did not mean his own campaign of revenge had to end. His pale eyes fixed on the woman who had fought alongside Benjamin Morris with such unexpected ferocity. Catherine James, he had heard Stewart call her during his taunts. She was the key to everything now. The lever he could use to pry apart the fragile alliance that had defeated them. These mountain folk might have banded together to face an external threat, but they would scatter quickly enough when the danger became personal and specific. Marcus had learned patience during his years as an outlaw, had discovered that the most satisfying victories often required careful planning rather than immediate action. He would wait, would watch, would learn their routines and weaknesses. And when the moment was right, he would strike in a way that would leave Benjamin Morris wishing he had never crossed paths with Jacob Stewart's gang. Below in the clearing, Catherine was helping Julie Peterson down from the horse where she had been bound for days. The young woman was barely conscious, her face bearing evidence of the cruelties she had endured during her captivity. Catherine's gentle ministrations spoke of someone who understood suffering intimately, who knew how to offer comfort without overwhelming someone who had been pushed beyond their limits. Benjamin stood nearby, his rifle still ready despite the apparent end to the immediate threat. His eyes constantly scanned the tree line, and Marcus had to admit a grudging respect for the man's tactical awareness. Benjamin Morris was no soft city dweller playing at frontier life. He was a genuine threat who would need to be handled with extreme care. Eugene Kim was organizing the other settlers, assigning them to search the surrounding forest for any additional gang members who might have escaped the final battle. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows, knowing that discovery now would mean certain death. These men were still running on the adrenaline of combat, still ready to shoot first and ask questions later. As the search party spread out through the forest, Marcus began his own careful withdrawal, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator who had learned to survive by avoiding confrontation when the odds were unfavorable. He had cached supplies at various locations throughout these mountains, had prepared bolt holes and escape routes that even Stewart had not known about. He could disappear for weeks or months if necessary, could wait until the settlers relaxed their vigilance, and return to their normal routines. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The woman was clearly important to Benjamin Morris in ways that went beyond their supposed business arrangement. The way the man positioned himself protectively near her, the way his eyes sought her out during lulls in the fighting, suggested an emotional attachment that could be exploited. Marcus had made a career of identifying people's weaknesses and using them for his own advantage. Some men could be broken through physical pain, others through threats to their property or to reputation. But the most devastating attacks were always those that targeted what people loved most. Benjamin Morris loved Catherine James, and that love would ultimately destroy them both. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Marcus finally reached his primary cache, a carefully concealed cave system that provided shelter, supplies, and multiple escape routes. He had discovered this place during the gang's first weeks in these mountains, had recognized its strategic value immediately. Now it would serve as his base of operations for a much more personal campaign. Inside the cave, Marcus took inventory of his resources. He had enough food and ammunition to last several weeks, along with tools and equipment that would allow him to move undetected through the wilderness. More importantly, he had detailed knowledge of the gang's previous reconnaissance, information about the locations and routines of every homestead and settlement in the region. The settlers would be expecting him to flee the area entirely, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the scene of his companion's defeat. Instead, he would remain close, would study his targets until he knew their habits better than they knew themselves. Catherine James had fought bravely during the battle, but courage in the face of open combat was very different from the kind of psychological endurance required to withstand a prolonged campaign of terror. Marcus spent the evening planning his approach, sketching maps and timelines that would allow him to strike when his targets were most vulnerable. He would not make Stuart's mistake of rushing into a direct confrontation with superior numbers. Instead, he would wage a war of attrition, picking away at their confidence and security until they made the kinds of mistakes that would give him the opportunities he needed. The first phase would be surveillance, learning everything he could about Catherine and Benjamin's daily routines. Where did they go for water? What paths did they use when traveling to the trading post? When were they separated and for how long? Every detail would be cataloged and analyzed for potential exploitation. The second phase would be psychological warfare. Small actions designed to create fear and uncertainty without revealing his presence directly. Disturbed campsites, missing supplies, signs that someone had been watching them. The goal would be to erode their sense of security, to make them constantly look over their shoulders and question every shadow. Only in the final phase would he reveal himself, and by then his targets would already be weakened by weeks of mounting tension and paranoia. Catherine James would understand that her defiance during the battle had consequences, that some enemies could not be defeated by superior firepower and favorable terrain. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile as he settled down for the night, his plans taking shape with the clarity that came from absolute commitment to a course of action. The other settlers would eventually return to their own concerns, would assume that the threat had passed with Stuart's death. But Marcus Thorne was patient, and patient men often achieved victories that eluded their more impulsive counterparts. Meanwhile, in the cabin below, Catherine was experiencing the strange mixture of relief and exhaustion that followed intense combat. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but she could still feel the phantom weight of the rifle in her arms, could still hear the deafening roar of gunfire echoing in her memory. She had killed men today, had taken human lives to protect herself and Benjamin. The magnitude of that action was only beginning to register in her consciousness. Benjamin moved around the cabin with methodical efficiency, checking the damage from the battle and beginning the process of repairs that would be necessary before the next storm arrived. Several windows had been shattered by gunfire, and there were bullet holes in the walls that would need to be patched before they became pathways for the bitter mountain cold. He asked, pausing in his work to study her face with the kind of attention he usually reserved for reading weather signs or tracking game. Catherine considered the question seriously, trying to assess her own emotional state with the same honesty she had learned to apply to practical matters. Quote 166, she said finally. Quote 167. Benjamin nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. Quote 168. Quote 169. Quote 170. The words carried a weight of recognition that made Catherine's chest tighten with emotion. She had indeed found something in herself during the battle, a core of steel she had never suspected existed. But more than that, she had found her place in this harsh world, had proven herself worthy of the respect and partnership Benjamin offered. Julie Peterson was sleeping fitfully on the small cot they had prepared for her, occasionally crying out in her dreams as her mind processed the traumas she had endured. Catherine had cleaned her wounds and given her what comfort she could, but she knew that some injuries went deeper than anything that could be treated with bandages and gentle words. Eugene Phillips had been taken to Eugene Kim's cabin, where his wife would tend to her injuries and begin the long process of helping her readjust to freedom. Both women would bear the scars of their captivity for the rest of their lives, reminders of how quickly safety could be stripped away in this unforgiving environment. So in Botown, Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Benjamin paused in his work, his expression growing thoughtful. Quote 172. The honesty of his response was both sobering and oddly comforting. Catherine had learned to appreciate Benjamin's refusal to offer false reassurances or sugarcoat the realities they faced. If he said the immediate threat was over, she could trust that assessment while remaining prepared for whatever might come next. As evening settled over the mountains, the other settlers began preparing to return to their own homes and families. They had risked their lives to come to Benjamin and Catherine's aid, had demonstrated the kind of solidarity that made survival possible in this harsh environment. But they also had their own responsibilities, their own preparations to complete before winter settled in with full force. Eugene Kim approached the cabin as Benjamin was boarding up the broken windows, his weathered face serious but not unfriendly. He said without preamble, Catherine felt a flush of pride at the compliment, coming as it did from a man whose opinion carried considerable weight among the mountain settlers. Eugene Kim was known for his practical wisdom and his ability to assess character accurately. Benjamin replied. Eugene waved away the thanks with a gesture that suggested such mutual aid was simply expected among neighbors. Quote 177. He glanced toward Catherine, including her in the conversation with the kind of respect she had learned to value highly. Glory 78. Catherine was not sure whether this was good news or bad, and her uncertainty must have shown on her face. 179. Eugene continued. Benjamin nodded grimly, understanding the implications immediately. The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Eugene offering practical advice about maintaining security and avoiding unnecessary risks. When he finally prepared to leave, he shook hands with both Benjamin and Catherine, a gesture that formally acknowledged her as an equal partner in their mountain enterprise. After the other settlers had departed, Catherine and Benjamin spent the evening in quiet conversation, processing the events of the day and beginning to plan for the challenges that lay ahead. The immediate crisis had passed, but they both understood that their lives had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Catherine said as they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal of bread and preserved meat. Benjamin was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames as though seeking answers there. He said finally. What is on? Catherine understood that he was speaking from personal experience, referring to whatever tragedies had driven him from his previous life in Ohio. She had learned not to press him for details about his past, but she could see the shadows it cast across his present. 187, she admitted. 188. 189. 190. 191. His words provided the absolution Catherine had not realized she needed. The woman she had been in Philadelphia would have been horrified by her actions today, would have spent weeks agonizing over the moral implications of taking human life. But that woman had lived in a world where such choices were made by others, where violence was something that happened to other people in distant places. The woman she had become understood that some situations offered no moral ambiguity, no room for philosophical debate. When predators threatened everything she cared about, the only acceptable response was to fight with everything she possessed. As they prepared for bed that night, Catherine found herself acutely aware of the new intimacy that had developed between them. They had shared mortal danger, had trusted each other with their lives in the most literal sense possible. The careful distance they had maintained since her arrival seemed suddenly artificial and unnecessary. She said as he banked the fire for the night, he looked up at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Benjamin studied her face for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing her words against his own desires and reservations. Finally, he nodded slowly, understanding that some needs transcended the careful boundaries they had established. That night, for the first time since their arrangement had begun, Catherine fell asleep in Benjamin's arms, her head resting against his chest as she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was not passion that drove them together, but something deeper and more fundamental. The recognition that they had found in each other exactly what they needed to face whatever challenges this harsh world might present. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the distant ridge, or the cold eyes that cataloged every detail of their newfound closeness. Marcus Thorne observed their tender moment with the calculating attention of a predator studying his prey, already formulating plans that would turn their greatest strength into their most devastating weakness. The next morning brought a return to the practical necessities of mountain life, but with a subtle shift in the dynamic between Catherine and Benjamin. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity to each other's presence that spoke of barriers that had been crossed during the night. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Benjamin as he worked to repair the damage from yesterday's battle, noting the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face as he fitted new glass into the broken window frames. She had always been aware of his physical presence, but now that awareness carried a different quality, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For his part, Benjamin seemed more protective than usual, positioning himself between Catherine and the forest whenever they worked outside, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for potential threats. The battle had reminded him how quickly their peaceful existence could be shattered, how vulnerable they remained despite their defensive preparations. "Do you think we should consider Obese somewhere safer?" Catherine asked as they worked together to patch the bullet holes in the cabin walls. "Somewhere closer to other settlers, where we wouldn't be so isolated?" Benjamin paused in his work, considering the question seriously. "We could. Eugene Kim mentioned that there's good land available near his place, close enough to other homesteads that we'd have help if trouble came calling again." "But you don't want to leave here." "This place has become home in a way I didn't expect. We've built something here, Catherine. Something that belongs to us in ways that go beyond legal ownership." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. The cabin represented more than just shelter. It was the physical manifestation of their partnership, the place where she had transformed herself from a desperate refugee into a woman capable of defending what she loved. Leaving would feel like abandoning not just a location, but an essential part of who they had become together. "Then we stay," she said simply. "We make this place as secure as we can, and we face whatever comes next from here." Benjamin smiled at her words, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "We'll need to make some changes. Better defensive positions, more warning systems, maybe even a safe room where you could hide if another gang comes through." "I won't hide, Benjamin. Not anymore. If trouble comes, we face it together, just like we did yesterday." The determination in her voice was absolute, and Benjamin could see that arguing would be pointless. The woman who had once begged for any work at all had discovered a core of steel that would not bend, even in the face of mortal danger. They spent the next several days implementing improvements to their security, working with a shared sense of purpose that drew them even closer together. Benjamin constructed concealed firing positions in the trees around the clearing, while Catherine organized their supplies to ensure they could withstand a prolonged siege if necessary. The work was interrupted frequently by visits from other settlers, neighbors who came to check on their recovery, and to share news from other parts of the mountains. Word of the battle had indeed spread quickly, and Catherine found herself something of a celebrity among the mountain folk, a status that both pleased and embarrassed her. It was during one of these visits that they learned troubling news. Ashley Diaz arrived on a cold morning with word that several homesteads had reported signs of surveillance, evidence that someone was watching their activities from concealed positions in the forest. "Could be nothing," Ashley admitted, as she accepted a cup of hot coffee with obvious gratitude. "Could just be folks being jumpy after what happened with Stewart's gang." But Matthew Hill found tracks near his place, fresh ones that didn't match any of his neighbors' boots. Benjamin and Catherine exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. It was possible that one or more members of Stewart's gang had survived the final battle and were now conducting reconnaissance for some kind of revenge attack. "What's on to 207?" Benjamin asked. Quote, "Oh, the phone." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The idea that someone might be watching them specifically, studying their routines and looking for weaknesses, was more unsettling than the prospect of another direct attack. After Ashley left, Benjamin began implementing additional security measures, varying their daily routines and establishing signals they could use to communicate danger without alerting potential observers. Catherine learned to move through the forest with greater stealth, to use natural cover and concealment techniques that would make her a more difficult target. But despite their precautions, both of them could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the oppressive sense that they were being studied by someone with hostile intentions. The peaceful existence they had built together was once again under threat, this time from an enemy who remained hidden and unknown. Marcus Thorne was indeed watching, had been observing their activities for over a week from various concealed positions around their clearing. He had learned their routines, had identified the times when they were most vulnerable, had noted the defensive improvements they were making in response to reports of surveillance. The irony was not lost on him that their very awareness of being watched was providing him with valuable intelligence about their capabilities and preparations. Every defensive measure they implemented revealed something about their tactical thinking. Every precaution they took suggested a weakness they were trying to protect. He had been particularly interested in observing the relationship between Catherine and Benjamin. noting the way their partnership had evolved since the battle. They moved together now with the kind of unconscious coordination that spoke of deep intimacy, finishing each other's sentences and anticipating each other's needs with the fluency of long-married couples. That intimacy would be the key to his revenge. Marcus had learned during his years as an outlaw that the most effective way to destroy a man was not through direct violence, but through attacking what he loved most. Benjamin Morris clearly loved Catherine James with a devotion that bordered on worship, and that love would ultimately provide the leverage Marcus needed. The plan that had been forming in his mind was elegant in its simplicity. He would not attack them directly, would not give them the opportunity to fight back with the kind of desperate courage they had shown against Stewart's gang. Instead, he would separate them, would take Catherine when Benjamin was away from the cabin, and use her as bait to draw him into a trap. But the execution would require perfect timing and careful preparation. Benjamin was too experienced and too cautious to be easily deceived, and Catherine herself had proven more formidable than her appearance suggested. Marcus would need to create circumstances that would force them to make mistakes, to act out of desperation rather than careful planning. The opportunity he had been waiting for came on a morning when heavy snow began falling, the kind of storm that would limit visibility and muffle sound throughout the forest. Benjamin had gone to check his trap lines, a routine that normally took him several hours and would carry him well away from the cabin. Marcus had been watching long enough to know that Catherine usually spent such mornings working inside the cabin, tending to domestic tasks that kept her occupied and relatively stationary. Today, however, she surprised him by emerging from the cabin shortly after Benjamin's departure, carrying a rifle and moving with the purposeful stride of someone with a specific destination in mind. Curious about this deviation from her normal routine, Marcus followed at a distance, using the falling snow as cover, while tracking her movement through the forest. She was heading toward the spring that provided their water supply, a location that was partially concealed from the cabin by a stand of dense pine trees. As Catherine knelt by the spring to fill her water containers, Marcus realized that fortune had provided him with the perfect opportunity. She was alone, isolated from help, and the sound of the falling snow would cover any noise he might make in his approach. More importantly, Benjamin would not expect her to return for at least an hour, giving Marcus time to implement his plan before her absence was discovered. Moving with the silent efficiency of a practiced hunter, Marcus worked his way closer to Catherine's position, using the trees and undergrowth to mask his approach. He could see that she was alert, frequently pausing in her work to scan the surrounding forest, but her attention was focused on the areas where a direct attack might come from, rather than the concealed position he had chosen. When he was close enough to ensure success, Marcus made his move, emerging from concealment with his pistol drawn and aimed directly at Catherine's chest. The expression on her face as she turned toward the sound of his approach was everything he had hoped for: recognition, fear, and the dawning realization that she had walked into a trap. Quote 209, he said, using the name with deliberate mockery. Quote to Catherine's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle she had set aside while working at the spring, but Marcus was ready for such a response. "I wouldn't," he advised, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that suggested he would have no hesitation about carrying out his threat. "You're fast, I'll give you that, but you're not faster than a bullet." For a moment, Catherine considered her options, weighing the chances of reaching her weapon against the certainty of death if she failed. Marcus could see the calculation in her eyes, the same kind of tactical assessment that had served her well during the battle with Stewart's gang. "3," he said when she slowly raised her hands away from the rifle. "Quote Dayar." Quote Catherine asked, her voice steady despite the fear that must be racing through her system. Quote Tush, Marcus replied, the word carrying a weight of personal grievance that made it clear he viewed Stewart's death as a wrong that demanded retribution. "Your husband and his friends killed good men, men who were just trying to make a living in a hard world. That kind of thing can't go unanswered." Catherine almost laughed at the twisted logic that characterized armed robbery and murder as making a living. But she had enough sense to keep her thoughts to herself. Marcus Thorne was clearly unstable, operating under a moral code that justified any action in pursuit of his goals. "Benjamin will come looking for me," she said, hoping to plant seeds of doubt about the wisdom of his plan. I'm counting on it, Marcus replied with a smile that held no warmth. In fact, that's the whole point. You see, Mrs. Morris, you're not the real target here. You're just the bait I'm going to use to catch the fish I really want. The implications of his words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Marcus was not planning to simply kill her in revenge for Stuart's death. He was planning to use her as a weapon against Benjamin, to turn their love for each other into the instrument of their mutual destruction. Quote time kopom, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She knew that Benjamin's love for her might indeed override his tactical judgment, might drive him to take risks he would never consider if only his own life were at stake. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But love makes even smart men do stupid things. And your husband loves you more than his own life. I've been watching you two for days, seeing how you move together, how you look at each other. That kind of devotion is a weakness, Mrs. Morris, and weaknesses are meant to be exploited. Marcus gestured with his pistol toward a path that led deeper into the forest, away from the cabin and any possibility of rescue. Now we're going to take a little walk, you and I, somewhere private where we can wait for your husband to come calling. Catherine had no choice but to comply, but her mind was racing as they moved through the snow-covered forest. She needed to find a way to warn Benjamin, to prevent him from walking into whatever trap Marcus had prepared. But more than that, she needed to find a way to turn the tables on her captor, to transform herself from victim into threat. The woman who had once begged for any work at all was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required violence, that love sometimes demanded the willingness to kill or die. Marcus Thorne had made a fundamental error in his assessment of her character. He saw her devotion to Benjamin as a weakness to be exploited, when in reality it was the source of a strength he could not comprehend. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, Catherine began to plan. She would need to be patient, would need to wait for the right moment when Marcus's attention was divided or his guard was down. But when that moment came, she would be ready to act with the kind of decisive violence that had served her well during the battle with Stuart's gang. Behind them, the falling snow was already beginning to cover their tracks, erasing the evidence of their passage and making pursuit more difficult. But Catherine knew that Benjamin would come looking for her regardless of the weather or the danger, would risk everything to bring her home safely. The thought of his devotion filled her with both warmth and terror. She loved him for his willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety, but she also understood that such devotion could be the death of them both if she could not find a way to escape Marcus's trap. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife muffled by the heavy snowfall. Catherine found herself listening for any sign of pursuit, any indication that Benjamin had discovered her absence and was following their trail. But the silence remained unbroken except for the soft whisper of snow falling through the pine boughs. Marcus led her to a small clearing where the remains of an old hunting camp provided some shelter from the weather. The location had clearly been chosen with care. It offered good visibility in all directions while providing defensive positions for someone expecting to fight off attackers. Blue Marcus said as he surveyed the site with professional satisfaction. Quote, Catherine felt her stomach clench with fear. Not for herself, but for Benjamin. Marcus had indeed chosen his battleground well, had selected a location that would favor a defender over attackers approaching through the open ground of the clearing. Potuson, she said, making one last attempt to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in her captor. Quote, Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and bitter in the cold air. Quote, Catherine said, her own anger finally breaking through her fear. Quote, Trento. The words were a mistake, Catherine realized immediately. Marcus's face darkened with rage, and she could see his finger tighten on the trigger of his pistol. For a moment, she thought he might kill her on the spot, might abandon his carefully laid plans in favor of immediate vengeance. But Marcus managed to control himself, though the effort was clearly visible in the tension of his jaw and the whiteness of his knuckles. You'll have plenty of time to regret those words, Mrs. Morris, and so will your husband when he watches you pay for them. The threat was delivered with such casual malice that Catherine felt ice form in her veins. She was beginning to understand that Marcus Thorne was not simply a criminal seeking revenge. He was something much more dangerous. A man who had crossed the line into genuine evil and found pleasure in the suffering of others. As the afternoon wore on and the snow continued to fall, Catherine found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Months ago, she had been a desperate widow begging for any kind of work that might keep her alive. Now she was a mountain woman facing death with the kind of calm determination she would never have believed herself capable of possessing. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable, had required her to abandon many of the assumptions and beliefs that had once defined her identity, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities she had never suspected, had shown her that she was capable of far more than the protected existence she had lived in Philadelphia. If she died today, she would die as someone who had fought for what she loved, who had refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. That was not the fate she would have chosen, but it was a death she could accept with dignity and pride. But Catherine had no intention of dying if she could help it. Marcus might have the advantage of surprise and superior firepower, but she had something he lacked: the absolute certainty that Benjamin would come for her and the determination to be ready when he did. The sound of approaching footsteps reached them just as the afternoon light began to fade, the steady crunch of boots on snow that announced Benjamin's arrival with the inevitability of an approaching avalanche. Marcus smiled with satisfaction, his trap springing exactly as he had planned. He murmured, checking his weapons one final time. Close to while Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to Benjamin's approach, knowing that each step brought him closer to mortal danger. She had spent the last several hours trying to work free of the ropes that bound her to a tree at the edge of the clearing, but Marcus had tied them with the skill of someone experienced in restraining prisoners. Quote 234. Marcus called out when the footsteps were close enough. Quote 235. The footsteps stopped, and Catherine could imagine Benjamin assessing the situation, trying to determine the best approach to a tactical problem that offered no good solutions. She knew he would be studying the terrain, looking for cover and concealment that would allow him to get close enough to take effective action. Quote 226. Benjamin's voice carried clearly across the clearing, steady and controlled despite the circumstances. Your quarrel is with me, not with her. Oh, but you're wrong about that, Marcus replied, his pistol pressed against Catherine's temple to ensure that Benjamin could see the threat clearly. Quote 239. Catherine could see Benjamin now, a dark figure at the edge of the tree line, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Even at this distance, she could sense the coiled tension in his body, the predator's readiness that had kept him alive through years of frontier dangers. What do you want? Benjamin asked, though Catherine suspected he already knew the answer. Justice, Marcus replied, the word carrying the same twisted conviction Catherine had heard earlier. I want you to suffer the way you made me suffer, to lose everything that matters to you the way you took everything that mattered to me. Then let's settle this between us. Man to man, fair fight, winner takes all. Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the surrounding trees. Fair fight? There's nothing fair about what you did to my friends. You ambushed them, used superior numbers and defensive positions to cut them down like dogs. Your friends attacked innocent people, Benjamin replied, his voice carrying a note of steel that Catherine recognized from their most serious conversations. They got exactly what they deserved. The exchange was serving a purpose beyond mere negotiation, Catherine realized. Benjamin was buying time, was studying the situation and looking for any advantage he could exploit. She could see him shifting position slightly, using the conversation to mask his movement as he worked to find a better angle of attack. But Marcus was too experienced to be easily deceived. Stay where you are, Morris, he warned, pressing the pistol harder against Catherine's head. Quote 248. Catherine felt the cold metal against her skin and knew that Marcus was not bluffing. He had already crossed too many lines to hesitate at murder, had already demonstrated his willingness to kill anyone who stood in the way of his revenge. Quote 249. Benjamin said, raising his hands to show that he was not an immediate threat. Quote 250. Quote 251. Catherine wanted to scream at Benjamin not to comply, not to surrender the advantages that might allow him to rescue her. But she also understood that he had no choice, that Marcus would kill her without hesitation if his demands were not met. Benjamin's rifle hit the snow with a soft thump, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air. Catherine watched the man she loved walk into the open, making himself vulnerable in a desperate attempt to save her life. "That's better," Marcus said with satisfaction. "Oh, now we can all have a proper conversation about justice and consequences." But as Benjamin stepped into the clearing, Catherine saw something that made her heart leap with hope. He was not walking with the defeated posture of a man who had surrendered. Instead, he moved with the careful balance of someone preparing for action. His hands might be raised, but his body was coiled for violence, ready to explode into motion at the first opportunity. More importantly, Catherine could see that he was not alone. Shadows moved in the forest behind him, dark shapes that suggested other settlers had followed his trail and were now positioning themselves for their own attack. Eugene Kim's weathered face was briefly visible between the trees, along with the younger features of Matthew Hill and several other men Catherine recognized. Marcus had been so focused on Benjamin that he had failed to notice the approach of additional enemies, had made the same mistake that had doomed Jacob Stewart's gang during the battle at the cabin. He had assumed that his enemy would come alone, driven by love and desperation to attempt a rescue without backup or support. "You know what I think?" Benjamin said, his voice carrying a conversational tone that seemed completely at odds with the deadly situation. "I think you are not nearly as smart as you believe you are." Marcus frowned, sensing that something was wrong, but not yet understanding what. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you made the same mistake your boss made. You assumed that mountain folk don't look out for each other, that a man would come alone into a situation like this." The realization hit Marcus just as the first rifle shot rang out from the forest, Eugene Kim's bullet taking him high in the shoulder and spinning him away from Catherine. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as Marcus stumbled, his carefully laid trap collapsing in an instant of violence and confusion. Benjamin was moving before Marcus hit the ground, covering the distance between them with the fluid grace of a predator closing on wounded prey. Catherine saw the knife appear in his hand as though by magic, the blade reflecting the last light of the dying day as he prepared to end the threat permanently. But Marcus was not finished yet. Despite his wound, he managed to roll away from Benjamin's attack, his own knife appearing as he struggled to regain his footing. The two men circled each other in the snow, both bleeding, both committed to a fight that could only end with one of them dead. Catherine worked frantically at her bonds, using the distraction of the fight to make one final attempt at freedom. The ropes were tight, but Marcus had tied them in haste, and she could feel them beginning to give way under her desperate efforts. The knife fight was brutal and efficient, two experienced men using weapons they understood intimately. Marcus had the advantage of desperation, knowing that capture meant certain death, while Benjamin fought with the focused intensity of a man protecting everything he loved. Steel rang against steel as they tested each other's defenses, looking for the opening that would allow a killing stroke. Both men bore the scars of hard living, but Catherine could see that Benjamin was the superior fighter, his movements more controlled and economical. The end came suddenly, as such encounters often did. Marcus overextended himself in a desperate lunge, leaving himself open to the counterattack that Benjamin had been waiting for. The knife slid between his ribs with surgical precision, finding the heart with the kind of accuracy that spoke of extensive experience with violence. Marcus Thorne fell face first into the snow, his blood spreading in a dark stain that marked the end of his campaign of revenge. The last member of Jacob Stewart's gang was dead, and the threat that had haunted Catherine and Benjamin for weeks was finally over. Catherine felt the last of her bonds give way just as Benjamin reached her, his hands gentle as he helped her to her feet and checked her for injuries. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the aftershock of terror and relief, the knowledge that she had come within moments of death. "Are you hurt?" Benjamin asked, his voice rough with emotion as he ran his hands over her arms and face, searching for any sign that Marcus had harmed her. "I'm all right," Catherine managed, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "He didn't hurt me. He was saving that for when you arrived." Benjamin pulled her against his chest, his arms encircling her with a desperation that spoke of how close he had come to losing her. Catherine could feel him trembling, could sense the depth of fear he had experienced when he discovered her absence and realized what had happened. Eugene Kim and the other settlers emerged from the forest, their faces grim with the satisfaction of a job completed successfully. They had tracked Benjamin through the snow, had recognized the signs of pursuit and danger, and had responded with the kind of solidarity that defined life in these mountains. "Is it over now?" Catherine asked, looking around at the faces of the men who had risked their lives to save her. "It's over," Eugene confirmed, nudging Marcus's body with his boot to ensure there was no remaining threat. Worship 263. The words carried a weight of finality that Catherine found deeply comforting. The nightmare that had begun with distant gunshots weeks ago was finally concluded, ended by the same kind of community solidarity that had saved them during the original attack. As they made their way back through the forest toward the cabin, Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in these mountains as a desperate refugee, begging for any work that might keep her alive. Now she was walking home as a full partner in a relationship forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable, had required her to abandon many of the assumptions and beliefs that had once defined her identity, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities she had never suspected, had shown her that she was capable of far more than the protected existence she had lived in her previous life. Benjamin walked beside her, his hand never far from hers, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the vigilance that had become second nature. The experience with Marcus had reminded them both how quickly their peaceful existence could be shattered, but it had also demonstrated the strength of the bonds they had built with each other and with their neighbors. When they finally reached the cabin, Catherine felt a profound sense of homecoming that went beyond mere physical shelter. This place represented everything she had built with Benjamin, every choice she had made in transforming herself from victim to survivor to full partner in their mountain enterprise. The other settlers stayed long enough to share a meal and to discuss the practical implications of what had happened. Word would need to be sent to the authorities in the larger settlements, though everyone understood that formal law enforcement was largely irrelevant in these remote regions where people made their own justice. Kukuesh 264, Eugene Kim said as he prepared to leave. Kutuko 165. The words carried an official weight, a formal recognition of Catherine's transformation from outsider to accepted member of the mountain community. She had passed tests she had never known existed, had demonstrated the kind of courage and determination that this harsh environment demanded from anyone who wanted to survive and thrive. After the other settlers departed, Catherine and Benjamin spent the evening in quiet conversation, processing the events of the day and beginning to plan for the future that now lay open before them. The immediate threats were gone, but they both understood that new challenges would inevitably arise. "I've been thinking about what Eugene said," Catherine mentioned as they sat by the fire, sharing the kind of comfortable intimacy that had developed between them over the months of their partnership. "About earning our place here." Benjamin nodded, understanding the direction of her thoughts. "You've done more than earn your place, Catherine. You've become exactly the kind of woman this country needs, the kind who can face whatever comes and still find reasons to hope. I couldn't have done it without you. Without your patience and teaching, your willingness to see potential in someone who didn't even know her own capabilities." "We brought out the best in each other," Benjamin replied. "That's what real partnerships do." The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on practical matters like their plans for the coming spring and the improvements they wanted to make to their homestead. But underneath the practical discussions lay a deeper recognition of what they had built together, a relationship that had evolved from necessity into something much more profound and lasting. When they finally prepared for bed, Catherine found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once begged for any work at all was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and capabilities, someone who could face the future with confidence rather than desperation. As she settled into Benjamin's arms, Catherine felt a peace that went beyond mere physical safety. She had found her place in the world, had discovered not just where she belonged, but who she was meant to be. The mountains that had once seemed so forbidding and alien now felt like home in the truest sense of the word. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines with a sound that no longer carried threats of danger and uncertainty. Instead, it spoke of continuity and permanence, of a life built on solid foundations that could withstand whatever storms might come. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white that would soon give way to the green promise of spring. And in the warm cabin that had become the center of their shared existence, Catherine James Morris slept peacefully in the arms of the man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself. Spring arrived with the sudden intensity that characterized all seasonal changes in the high mountains, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a riot of green growth and flowing water almost overnight. Catherine stood on the cabin's front porch, watching the sun rise over peaks that no longer seemed forbidding and alien, but had become as familiar as the features of her own face. The months since Marcus Thorne's death had passed quietly, filled with the kind of routine domestic tasks that had once seemed impossible for a woman of her background to master. Now she moved through the daily requirements of mountain life with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, who had found her proper place in the world through trial and determination. Benjamin emerged from the cabin behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. The ritual had become one of their favorites. This quiet time before the day's work began, when they could simply enjoy each other's company in the spectacular beauty of their mountain home. Quote 272, Benjamin mentioned as he handed Catherine her cup. Quote 273. Catherine nodded, looking forward to the visit from their friend and occasional messenger. Ashley had become a regular visitor over the winter months, bringing news and supplies while carrying letters and messages to other isolated homesteads throughout the region. The young woman's friendship had meant more to Catherine than she had initially realized, providing a connection to the broader community of mountain folk that had become her adopted family. Ashley represented the kind of independence and self-reliance that Catherine had learned to value, a woman who had carved out her own place in a world that offered few opportunities for female autonomy. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them from the direction of the main trail. Ashley appeared a few minutes later, her horse moving with the easy gait of an animal that had traveled many miles but was not yet tired. Benjamin? Catherine? Ashley called out as she dismounted, her face bright with the kind of news that suggested important developments. I've got word from the territorial capital that you'll want to hear. Catherine felt a flutter of anxiety at the serious tone in Ashley's voice. News from the territorial government usually meant changes or complications that could affect their peaceful existence, reminders that they lived in a world where distant authorities could make decisions that impacted even the most remote settlements. Quote 276. Benjamin asked, though his relaxed posture suggested he was not expecting anything too disruptive. Quote 277. Ashley replied, accepting the cup of coffee Catherine offered with obvious gratitude. Quote 278, quote, the implications of such a development were enormous. Catherine realized as she processed Ashley's words. Statehood would mean better law enforcement, improved transportation, and economic opportunities that were currently impossible in the frontier territories. But it would also mean increased government oversight, taxation, and the kind of regulatory framework that might interfere with the independence that had drawn so many people to these remote regions in the first place. What's the timeline? Benjamin asked, his practical mind immediately focusing on the details that would determine how such changes might affect their lives. Could be as soon as next year, could be longer depending on politics back in Washington. But the territorial governor is pushing hard for it, says it's time to bring civilization to the frontier. Catherine almost smiled at the phrase, remembering her own assumptions about civilization and barbarism when she had first arrived in these mountains. The woman she had been then would have welcomed any development that promised to make life more like what she had known in Philadelphia. But the woman she had become understood that civilization was not necessarily synonymous with improvement, that the harsh simplicity of mountain life had virtues that more complex social arrangements often lacked. There's more, Ashley continued, her expression growing even more serious. They're talking about bringing in railroad surveyors, mapping routes through the mountain passes that could connect this region to the national transportation network. The news hit Catherine like a physical blow, though she was not immediately sure why. Railroads meant progress, meant connection to the broader world of commerce and culture that she had once taken for granted. But they also meant an end to the isolation that had allowed communities like theirs to develop their own ways of doing things. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had been their refuge and their challenge for so many months. Catherine could see him weighing the potential benefits against the inevitable costs, trying to assess how such dramatic changes might affect the life they had built together. How do folks feel about all this? He asked finally. Mixed, Ashley admitted. Some are excited about the opportunities, the chance to sell their timber and minerals to outside markets. Others are worried about losing the independence that brought them here in the first place. Catherine found herself thinking about Julie Peterson and Eugene Phillips, the women who had survived their captivity and were slowly rebuilding their lives with the support of the mountain community. Would they be better served by the arrival of formal law enforcement and medical facilities? Or would the intrusion of outside authority complicate their recovery? The question highlighted the complexity of progress, the way that improvements for some people could represent losses for others. The mountain community had developed its own ways of dealing with problems like trauma and recovery, methods that might be displaced by more formal, but not necessarily more effective approaches. What about you two? Ashley asked, studying their faces with the kind of attention that suggested she understood the significance of the decision they were facing. You planning to stay and adapt, or are you thinking about moving on to somewhere that's still truly frontier? The question forced Catherine to confront assumptions she had not even realized she was making. She had come to think of their mountain home as permanent, as the place where she would spend the rest of her life with Benjamin. But if that place was going to be fundamentally transformed by outside forces, would it still be the same home they had fought so hard to defend? We'll need to think about it, Benjamin said diplomatically, though Catherine could see that he was already beginning to process the implications of their various options. After Ashley left to continue her rounds, Catherine and Benjamin spent the day discussing the news and its potential impact on their future. The conversation was complicated by the fact that neither of them was entirely sure what they wanted, what kind of life they hoped to build together in the years ahead. Part of me is excited by the possibilities, Catherine admitted as they worked together in the garden they had planted behind the cabin. The idea of having access to books again, to music and theater and all the cultural opportunities I used to take for granted. Benjamin nodded, understanding her conflicted feelings. And part of you is afraid of losing what we found here. Exactly. This place changed me, Benjamin. It showed me capabilities I never knew I possessed, gave me a sense of purpose and belonging that I never found in my old life. I'm not sure I want to risk losing that for the sake of conveniences I'm not sure I actually need. The conversation continued over the following days as they went about their normal routines, each of them processing the implications of the coming changes in their own way. Catherine found herself paying closer attention to the details of their daily life, trying to assess what she would miss most if they decided to leave. The morning ritual of checking the animals and tending to the garden had become deeply satisfying in ways she would have found impossible to explain to her former self. There was something profoundly meaningful about producing food with her own hands, about understanding exactly where her sustenance came from and what was required to maintain it. Similarly, the evening conversations by the fire had developed a quality of intimacy that she suspected would be difficult to maintain in a more complex social environment. When your world consisted primarily of one other person, you learn to communicate with a depth and honesty that larger communities often discourage. It was during one of these evening conversations that Benjamin raised the possibility that had been lurking at the edges of both their minds since Ashley's visit. Quote 293, he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of a decision that would affect every aspect of their future. Quote 2094. Catherine felt her heart skip at the suggestion, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of excitement that surprised her with its intensity. The idea of another journey, another chance to test herself against unknown challenges, appealed to something fundamental in the woman she had become. Quote 285. She said, though her tone suggested she was considering the possibility seriously rather than rejecting it out of hand. 296. The words resonated with Catherine in ways that went beyond mere practical considerations. Benjamin was right that they had acquired capabilities and knowledge that would serve them well regardless of their location. But more than that, they had discovered something about themselves and their relationship that was portable, that did not depend on any particular place or set of circumstances. Woe 27, she asked, and Benjamin could hear in her voice that she was already beginning to embrace the idea. Quote, him. Catherine tried to imagine what such a journey would entail, what challenges they might face in crossing the vast distances that separated them from the Pacific coast. The woman who had struggled to walk from the train station to Benjamin's clearing would have been terrified by such a prospect. But the woman she had become found the idea exhilarating rather than frightening. When would we leave? Soon as the pass is clear completely, late spring, early summer. That would give us time to travel and get established before the next winter sets in. The timeline was aggressive, Catherine realized, but not impossible given their experience and preparation. They had learned to travel light and efficiently, to live off the land when necessary, to adapt quickly to new circumstances and challenges. More importantly, they had learned to work together as a team, to complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. That partnership would be their greatest asset, regardless of where their journey might take them. Over the next several weeks, they began making preparations for what would be their greatest adventure yet. Benjamin sold their surplus supplies to other settlers, keeping only what they could carry on horseback, while ensuring they had everything necessary for an extended journey through largely unsettled territory. Catherine found herself both excited and melancholy as she packed their belongings, preparing to leave the place that had become home in such a profound way. Every item she handled carried memories of the transformation she had undergone, reminders of lessons learned and challenges overcome. The cabin itself had become more than just shelter. It was the physical manifestation of everything she and Benjamin had built together, proof that two people could create something lasting and meaningful, even in the harshest circumstances. But Catherine had learned that home was not really about places or possessions. It was about the people you shared your life with and the sense of purpose that guided your choices. As long as she had Benjamin, as long as they continued to face the world together as equal partners, she would be home regardless of their location. The decision to leave was made easier by the changes that were already beginning to affect their mountain community. Surveyors had indeed arrived to map potential railroad routes, and their presence was attracting the kind of speculators and opportunists who typically preceded major development projects. The quiet solidarity that had characterized relationships among the mountain folk was beginning to give way to the kind of competitive individualism that Catherine remembered from her city life. People were starting to think about their land in terms of potential profit rather than sustainable livelihood, and the shift was affecting the social dynamics that had made their community so appealing. Eugene Kim stopped by one evening to discuss their plans, his weathered face reflecting the same kind of mixed feelings that Catherine and Benjamin were experiencing. "Hate to see you go," he said simply. "You two proved yourselves in ways that matter, became the kind of neighbors a person can count on when trouble comes calling." "We hate to leave," Benjamin replied, "but this place is changing, becoming something different from what drew us here in the first place." Eugene nodded, understanding exactly what Benjamin meant. "Progress, they call it, though I'm not always sure it's an improvement over what we had before." The conversation continued for several hours, touching on the practical aspects of their departure and the emotional complexity of leaving a place that had been so important in their development as individuals and as a couple. When Eugene finally prepared to leave, he shook hands with both of them in the formal way that marks significant occasions among the mountain folk. "You'll do well wherever you end up," he said. "Got the kind of partnership that can handle whatever the world throws at it." His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the assessment of someone who had observed their relationship through its most challenging phases and found it worthy of respect and admiration. The final weeks before their departure passed quickly, filled with the countless details that such a major transition required. Catherine found herself taking long walks around their property, trying to memorize every detail of the place that had been so crucial in her transformation from desperate refugee to confident mountain woman. The spring that had provided their water supply, the clearing where she had first encountered Benjamin, the garden where they had worked together to produce food for their table, all of these locations held memories that she wanted to preserve, regardless of where their future travels might take them. Benjamin spent his time ensuring that their route was properly planned and provisioned, drawing on his extensive knowledge of frontier travel to minimize the risks they would face during their journey west. He had made such trips before, had learned through experience what was essential and what was merely convenient when crossing vast distances through largely unsettled territory. But this journey would be different from his previous travels, Catherine realized, because this time he would be responsible for someone else's safety and well-being. The knowledge that her survival depended on his judgment and preparation added a weight to his planning that had not been present during his solitary wanderings. The night before their departure, they sat together on the cabin's front porch, sharing what would be their final evening in the place that had become so important to both of them. The mountains around them were bathed in the soft light of a full moon, creating a scene of such beauty that Catherine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Are you having second thoughts?" Benjamin asked, noting her emotional state with the kind of sensitivity that had developed between them over the months of their partnership. "No," Catherine replied, and was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, but I'm also grateful for what this place gave us, for the chance to discover who we really are when everything else is stripped away." Benjamin took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "We'll carry that with us wherever we go. The knowledge, the confidence, the understanding that we can handle whatever challenges we might face." The morning of their departure dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp mountain air that seemed to promise good weather for traveling. Catherine woke early, her body automatically adjusting to the rhythm that would govern their days on the trail. Their preparations had been thorough and methodical, the result of months of planning and the hard-earned wisdom of people who understood the difference between essential supplies and unnecessary luxuries. Each item in their packs had been chosen for its utility and portability, everything else left behind or sold to other settlers who would remain in the mountains. Catherine found herself moving through the familiar routines of their morning ritual with a heightened awareness, knowing that this would be the last time she performed these tasks in this particular place. The simple act of making coffee took on a ceremonial quality, a final communion with the home they were leaving behind. Benjamin loaded their horses with the methodical efficiency that characterized all his practical activities, checking and double-checking the balance and security of their packs. Their animals were strong and well-trained, capable of carrying them across the vast distances that lay between their mountain home and their intended destination in Oregon Territory. As they prepared to mount up and begin their journey, Ashley Diaz appeared on the trail, having ridden through the night to bid them farewell. Her presence was a reminder of the connections they were leaving behind, the community that had accepted Catherine as one of their own, despite her unlikely origins. "Couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye properly," Ashley said as she dismounted, her face showing the fatigue of her long ride but also the warmth of genuine affection. The farewell was brief but meaningful, marked by the kind of understated emotion that characterized relationships among people who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. There were no dramatic declarations or elaborate promises to stay in touch. Instead, there was simply the recognition that they had shared something important and that the memory of that sharing would endure regardless of distance or time. "Take care of each other," Ashley said as they prepared to leave, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were undertaking. "We will," Catherine replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The first miles of their journey took them along familiar trails, through country that had become as well known to Catherine as the streets of Philadelphia had once been. But gradually, as the morning wore on, they moved beyond the boundaries of their usual travels, entering territory that was new and unknown. Catherine felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of discovery, the same excitement that had sustained her during the most difficult phases of her adaptation to mountain life. The woman who had once begged for any work at all had been replaced by someone who actively sought out challenges, who found meaning and purpose in testing herself against the unknown. The trail they followed was well established, marked by the passage of countless travelers who had made the same journey west in search of opportunities and new beginnings. But Catherine understood that each person's experience of that journey was unique, shaped by their individual circumstances and the particular challenges they encountered along the way. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following passes that would eventually lead them down into the great valleys of the West, Catherine found herself thinking about the nature of transformation and the ways that people could change when circumstances demanded it. The woman she had been in Philadelphia seemed like a stranger now, someone she had read about in a book rather than actually lived as. That woman had been defined by her limitations, by the things she could not do, and the experiences she was not strong enough to handle. But the woman she had become was defined by her capabilities, by the knowledge that she could adapt and survive, and even thrive in circumstances that would have destroyed her former self. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable, but it had revealed strengths and potentials that she never would have discovered in the safety of her previous existence. Benjamin rode beside her with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in the wilderness, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of weather changes or potential dangers. But Catherine noticed that his vigilance was different now from what it had been during their early days together. He no longer treated her as someone who needed protection from the harsh realities of their environment. Instead, he treated her as a full partner, someone whose judgment and capabilities he trusted completely. The shift was subtle but profound, reflecting the depth of the changes that had occurred in their relationship over the months of their partnership. As the day progressed and they covered mile after mile of challenging terrain, Catherine found herself settling into the rhythm of long-distance travel with surprising ease. Her body had adapted to the demands of frontier life, had developed the strength and endurance that such journeys required. But more than physical adaptation, she had developed the mental toughness that separated successful frontier travelers from those who turned back at the first sign of difficulty. She understood now that discomfort and hardship were simply part of the experience, temporary inconveniences to be endured rather than insurmountable obstacles. The trail took them through country of spectacular beauty, vast landscapes that dwarfed human concerns and put individual struggles into perspective. Catherine found herself awed by the grandeur of the mountains and valleys they traversed, reminded once again of how small her problems had been in the context of the natural world. But she also found herself appreciating the human capacity for adaptation and survival. The way that people could learn to thrive even in environments that seemed impossibly harsh and unforgiving. Every mile they traveled was proof of that capacity, evidence that determination and partnership could overcome almost any obstacle. As evening approached and they began looking for a suitable campsite, Catherine realized that she was not tired in the way she would have expected after such a demanding day. Instead, she felt energized by the prospect of the journey ahead, excited about the challenges and opportunities that awaited them in Oregon Territory. The campsite Benjamin selected was sheltered and defensible, located near a stream that would provide fresh water and positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks. As they went through the familiar routine of setting up camp, Catherine marveled at how natural and comfortable the process had become. The woman who had once struggled to boil water over an open fire now moved through the tasks of frontier camping with practiced efficiency, her hands knowing exactly what needed to be done without conscious direction from her mind. As they sat by their campfire that first evening, sharing a simple meal and planning the next day's travel, Catherine felt a profound sense of contentment that had nothing to do with physical comfort or material security. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside her. The journey ahead would undoubtedly bring challenges and hardships that she could not yet imagine, but Catherine faced those prospects with confidence rather than fear. She had learned that she was capable of far more than she had ever suspected, that love and partnership could provide strength that no individual could achieve alone. The fire crackled softly in the gathering darkness, casting dancing shadows on the faces of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to face whatever the world might offer. Above them, the stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, ancient lights that had witnessed countless human journeys and would witness countless more. Catherine James Morris pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders and smiled at the man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself, who had offered her not just work but partnership, not just survival, but the chance to become everything she was meant to be. The woman who had once begged for any work at all was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most important work was the daily task of building a life worth living with someone worth loving. And as the fire burned down to glowing embers and the night settled around their small camp, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equal partners in the greatest adventure of all. The mountains that had once seemed so forbidding now felt like old friends bidding them farewell, their snow-capped peaks catching the last light of the setting sun in a display of beauty that took Catherine's breath away. Tomorrow would bring new country, new challenges, new opportunities to test the strength of the bond they had forged in the crucible of survival and hardship. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars that connected all places and all times, Catherine James Morris was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to share her journey with, ready for whatever wonders and trials the future might hold. The wind whispered through the pines with a sound that spoke of continuity and change, of endings that were also beginnings, of journeys that transformed not just locations, but the very souls of those who undertook them. And in that whisper, Catherine heard the voice of the woman she had become, strong and confident and ready for anything, speaking words that would have been impossible for her former self to comprehend. Any work at all, and she whispered to the night sky, her voice carrying laughter and love, and the absolute certainty of someone who had found her true calling. I said I'd do any work at all, but the work I found was the work of becoming myself, and that work will never be finished. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnesses to a transformation that was both deeply personal and universally human. The story of someone who had discovered that the greatest adventures were not about reaching destinations, but about becoming worthy of the journey itself. And in the morning when the sun rose over the peaks that had been their home and their teacher, Catherine and Benjamin would continue west, carrying with them everything they had learned about love and survival, partnership and transformation, ready to write the next chapter of a story that had begun with desperation and had become a testament to the power of human resilience and the endless possibilities that opened when two people chose to face the world together.